Welcome to the Brain People Podcast, a show where four mental health experts team up to bring you practical tools for overcoming mental health challenges. The Brain People don't replace your doctor or therapist, but we will give you some extra tools to help you on your journey. So join us as we fight mental illness, one episode at a time.
Welcome, listeners, to another Brain People Podcast episode. My name is Jonathan Edens. I am one of the co-hosts. I am a psychiatric PA, and I am being joined with one of our other co-hosts that I'm sure you all know and love.
Hi, everyone. I'm Dr. Katie Cruz, a licensed clinical psychologist.
So we have another exciting episode for you guys today, one that I'm always interested in learning more about because I think it is incredibly practical for a wide variety of mental health conditions. And this is coming from sort of the sphere of psychology. And Katie, why don't you explain to us a little bit about what we're going to be talking about today?
Yeah, so we're going to be talking about what radical acceptance is. And it's a little bit like we could just have this as a general topic, but it's also part of the ongoing DBT series, Dialectical Behavioral Therapy. It's a whole skill in the DBT manual. And so, yeah, we're going to talk about what it is, what it's not, why it's important. And as you mentioned, it's super practical. And for me, the way that I look at it, it's not just for people who struggle with mental health. It's really just an essential part of life. It's not just a skill, it's a mindset.
So could you do, in more specific terms, can you define for us what radical acceptance means in sort of this mindset you're talking about, but also as it relates to mental health?
Yeah, so the radical piece is complete and total, and that's mind, body, heart, just like all of you. And then the acceptance is accepting reality as it is. So complete and total acceptance of reality as it is.
Okay. What is it not? As another way of sort of defining it, what is radical acceptance not?
I'm glad you asked because some people hear that definition or hear just the terms radical acceptance and they jump to the conclusion that it means you're accepting that by saying it's okay, approving of it. So when you start thinking about, okay, I need to accept, this difficult thing in my life, and people start thinking, oh, that means that you're approving of it, that you're saying that it's okay, that, and some people also view it sometimes as weakness and passivity. You're just like, water off a duck's back, just accepting it versus no, it's saying this is reality. I'm not trying to be positive about it. I'm not trying to be negative. I'm just accepting it as it is, like the phrase, it is what it is.
So one thought that I have when you're talking about this, in terms of reality, can you explain to us why living in reality is important?
Yeah, I mean, I could go on for probably a long time talking about that.
Maybe how I should phrase the question is this a common problem that you see where your patients don't live in reality?
Yes, definitely. And patients, but also people. Let me kind of start with people, then narrow into people that are my patients. I'll give a great example. Right now, we are living in a very politically charged climate. Part of that is because we're not accepting the reality that people have differences.
Sure.
So accepting reality is important in order to, a big part of it is reducing anger, right? Reducing conflict and so forth. Now then narrowing into my patients or people who struggle with mental health conditions, that applies kind of on a magnified level. So not only are they having difficulty accepting politics, but they also might be having difficulty accepting their mental illness. They're having difficulty accept their spouse, other things. And especially where it becomes really problematic is difficulty accepting everyday moment to moment things that are even just, this is why this is often under the umbrella of distress tolerance in DBT, because if you're not accepting reality, you're not tolerating distress. You're not learning to just live with reality as it is.
So when I hear about patients not living in reality. The ones that come to mind are my psychotic patients, at least initially, right? The ones that in many cases live outside reality because their psychosis precludes them from doing so. And so, I know that's not necessarily what we're talking about. We're not talking about accepting those types of unreal experiences per se. So would it be fair to say that maybe one other way we could say this is accepting your interpretation of the reality that we all share? Is that maybe another way of saying it, or no?
So I don't often think about psychotic patients because I don't really deal with them, but I think what you're describing is, one aspect of reality, right? Considering whether or not there's a chair in front of me, right? But when it comes to, less severe forms of mental illness, where they're not accepting other aspects of reality, right? For example, road rage, which it's kind of interesting that you bring up psychosis, where you say, oh, yeah, that's illogical. But when you really think about our inability to accept reality on a smaller scale or things that are not as concrete as, this chair is here, road rage is illogical. We're not accepting the reality that different people drive in different ways for different reasons, whether it's a momentary thing of someone is speeding to get home, or that there are different ways of driving. But we have this illogical standard often of what we want. And so I'm not saying everyone's psychotic, but I do think that there's a spectrum of delusion. And this is why it's so important that we need to accept reality of what's actually happening. And without any, and this is very related to mindfulness, which we did an episode on, is being so present in the moment without any judgment or attachment. This concept of radical acceptance is saying, I'm not judging it as positive or negative. It's just I'm accepting what is the reality, not my interpretation, just what it is.
So I think we touched on this a little bit, but I know you probably want to elaborate on this. So what makes radical acceptance so important? Why is it important for us to accept reality the way that it is?
Yes, I love talking about this when I do a whole kind of group session on DBT. So I'm just going to kind of go through each one. And if we want to talk more about it, I'll definitely emphasize one that I love to really elaborate on. The first one is rejecting reality does not change reality. And I say that because you can see that a lot of individuals, the reason why they're not accepting reality is they think somehow if I reject it, then it changes reality. A great example of this is our avoidance through addictions. And I don't only mean substances, I also mean phone and so forth. Our addiction to rumination, our addiction to control. Much of this is a response of maybe if I reject reality, it'll somehow magically change. If I avoid the reality, somehow it's going to magically change. And, I've mentioned this quote before in another episode, but avoiding reality, like you can avoid reality, but you can't avoid the consequences of avoiding reality. It's still there. And so if I close my eyes, it's kind of like those kids who they think that if you hide, if I'm hiding and I can't see you, then you can't see me. And it's like, no, that's not reality. And so it's important to accept reality because rejecting it does not change it. Now, another thing to consider of why to accept it is changing reality actually first requires accepting it. In preparing for this episode, I was doing some extra reading, and there was this article that was talking about, radical acceptance cannot be applied to domestic violence. And I disagree. Now, this is probably because they start to think, oh, that means that you're approving of it. But going back to the point that changing reality first requires to accept it, domestic violence, if you think about why people stay stuck in the cycle of violence, is because they haven't accepted this is abusive. Instead, with love bombing and other things, they're like, oh, it's my fault, or I'm just not a good enough spouse, and oh, they'll change. That's delusional, right? They're not accepting reality. So it's important to realize accepting reality actually is the first step to changing reality. I gather all the data of what is happening in my life right now, and let's apply it also to mental illness. I accept this is the reality. I have depression. People are like, oh, that means you're just kind of caving into it and giving in. No, I'm accepting it. Now it frees me up to, or more so motivates me to then, how do I change that? Or what's in my control? And so really, yeah, accepting reality helps us to then take the steps necessary to change that reality if it is in our control.
Yeah, it kind of puts you in more so the position of power or position of strength, right? When you're willing to accept that it is, like you said, it is what it is, and so therefore, rather than maybe wallowing in self pity, might be one way to say it, or as you said, trying to avoid it, being the victim of it, it sort of changes the power play, the power dynamic, if you will, and allows you to sort of take over the reins.
Yes, and I agree with that 100%. And a big part of mental health treatment that I'm starting to realize more and more is empowerment. How do I how do I accept that I have choices, that I have the ability to control some things, not everything, which later, well, I'll just mention it now because we're on the topic. We also need to accept the reality that I can't control everything, right? Um, Now, another reason to accept reality is pain can't be avoided. And because it can't be avoided, we need to accept it. And I love there's this equation that I often reference is suffering equals pain times resistance. Where if you think about it, pain is that independent variable, right? It can't be avoided. And we often try to, much of the addictions today, much of society are just different ways of trying to avoid pain, including medication. Sometimes people just pop a pill, right? I have a headache, not even thinking about, oh, it's because I'm not drinking enough water. So pain is unavoidable, but suffering can be reduced depending upon your level of resistance. So if I resist pain more, I cause myself more suffering. If I accept the pain, I can actually reduce my suffering. So an example of this could be, if you avoid the pain of a broken arm, you might say, okay, I'm avoiding it. I don't want to deal with it. I resist it. I cause myself more suffering. I used to use that analogy with veterans where years passed avoiding their trauma, avoiding, and they were causing themselves more and more suffering, high rates of divorce, high rates of addictions, and so forth. Instead of accepting, I have experienced this trauma, I have PTSD, and then they were able to go and get treatment and the suffering was reduced. And so suffering equals pain times resistance. We can't avoid pain. So what instead we can do, which is the variable that's dependent, is our resistance or acceptance. And a little bit of that too is not only can we not fully avoid pain, but all emotions come together. So if we try to avoid pain, we also avoid joy. And I see that a lot with my patients. And this is where refusing to accept reality often gets you stuck in unhappiness, bitterness, anger, sadness, shame, and so forth. But acceptance frees us up and our energy up to then focus on change. And then I just like to also mention that sometimes acceptance can lead to more sadness. It's kind of like a grief process, but calmness or peace tends to follow afterwards. So I'm not saying acceptance immediately results to happiness and joy, but it really reduces the anger and the other emotions that then can free us up to experience peace.
Yeah, those are a lot of interesting points. And I think myself and our listeners are likely going to have to rewind and sit with some of those. And yeah, I think for some people, they might even be either turned off or offended or just sort of that like immediate kind of resistance to some of those things that you're saying. But I mean, it's clear to me that there's definitely truth in all of those points. And I think it'd be good for all of us, especially those that have dealt with a lot of pain, suffering, a lot of resistance to many things, who are dealing with a myriad of mental health issues, to really highly consider what Katie is saying here, and and hopefully that'll lead to some breakthroughs. So moving on from that, what is it exactly that we should be accepting in order to help ourselves in our mental health journeys?
So this is a very big umbrella. And so it's not comprehensive what I'm going to mention, but what I've tried to do is I'm going to try to mention the biggest areas that I see a lack of acceptance and more resistance. Now, obviously, there's the big umbrella of reality, and we could kind of further distill it down to past and present. So the past category, you can think about anyone who's ruminating about the past, that lives with a lot of regrets. They're not accepting that the past is the past. It is done. There's nothing I can do to correct the past. And so accepting that might lead you to making amends currently, or it might lead you to saying, there really isn't anything that I can do. And so I need to fully bury that. But reality accepting it can include accepting the past, but then also the present, right? And not really, we don't have control over the future. So I guess the only thing that would really fall under the category of the future is accepting that I cannot control the future, which I know a lot of my patients try to do with fortune telling and predicting and trying to put a lot of energy into the future or the past, in which doesn't allow you to be very focused on the only moment that you can change, which is the present. Now, another one that I think is really important to emphasize is to accept that life can be worth living even with painful events in it. Because sometimes we have this kind of push and pull, or this all or nothing thinking that either there's pain or there's joy. And so when I experience pain, I want to avoid it and resist it, but that causes more suffering. Or I think, okay, I cannot live a good life with that pain. And I can think about a lot of different examples, including many of my patients who have experienced trauma. Now, notice I'm not saying that, oh, the trauma itself was worth it. That is a terrible thing. And radical acceptance is saying, I'm accepting that it was terrible, but there's an and. It can be terrible, and I can still live a life worth living. I like to use the analogy of it's a book, right? That's chapters 1 and 2. And my life continues on, and so I can continue to write other chapters, experience other things. And so it's good for us to accept, wow, pain, life can still be worth living even with pain. Now, I wanted to give some examples, and Jonathan, feel free to throw out some of your own examples that you can think of. And again, not a comprehensive list, but some that I think are really critical. The first one is chronic illness. This could apply both to mental illness as well as physical. So I often think about the example of my chronic pain patients. Now, let me just kind of hear your thoughts for a moment, Jonathan. How would you see what you've heard from me thus far and what you know about radical acceptance? How would you see radical acceptance applying to someone who has chronic pain and how it could be helpful?
I mean, I can see it in a number of different ways. I think for many of the patients that I've dealt with that had chronic pain, they're always looking for, say, that thing that's going to help with their chronic pain. And so it ends up being this endless journey of just frustration that they're not able to achieve the goal. And so that radical acceptance of, hey, maybe there isn't really an option for me to experience, a complete alleviation of said pain. And so rather than focusing on said future, event, which I'm not necessarily saying, improper sort of balance, if you will, shouldn't be attempted at being achieved. But maybe the radical acceptance might just be, I'm going to choose to live present in sort of the present moment, with the life that I have, with the family that I have, with the good things, right? In spite of the ongoing pain that I may be dealing with.
Yeah, and to add to what you just mentioned, a big part of that is adjusting accordingly to that diagnosis, because a lot of chronic pain patients are trying to live how they used to live, and that's not accepting. And so you think about the cycle of chronic pain in which they work, and then they pass their limit, and then they crash for several days. And then they work, and it's this all or nothing instead of a common treatment approach is pacing, right? If I get exhausted at 20 minutes, then I'm going to tap out at 10. And so they're not really accepting, I have a different life now, right? So acceptance could be helpful for them to manage that. And that applies to mental illness as well. How do I fully accept I have this diagnosis, bipolar disorder? A lot of individuals kind of deny or resist that they have this. And so they're not managing their sleep, which is often a trigger for a manic episode, or they're not taking their medication in a way that helps them manage those illnesses. I used to see this a lot also with people with diabetes, where they haven't fully accepted this is my life and I need to either, medication wise or nutrition or other things, manage it and manage it well. The other major thing to accept is people and who they are. So I see this way too often with couples where, there's a nagging spouse or there's just constant conflict. Why isn't he like this? Why isn't she like this? And sometimes I see with older couples, they finally just by exhaustion accept who they are. But instead of having to wait after years of conflict, I need to accept this is who they are. Now, that doesn't mean that, you're saying, they're never going to change. No, accepting them as they are right now. Accepting a good part of marital counseling that I talk about is, accepting that you had different childhoods, and that often leads to different conflicts of, you have different ways of different hygiene, and cleanliness standards, but accepting people who they are, that includes road rage and how they drive, but also accepting you can't control others. And maybe I should broaden that more about control. There's certain things that you just need to accept are out of my control. But for a lot of my patients, especially those high anxiety, sometimes ADHD, but mostly anxiety, perfectionism, they control or they try to control things that are not actually in their control. And so it creates this ongoing sense of helplessness, and they don't have energy to then control what they can. And so not just people, but also accepting that there are things that we cannot control, but also within the realm of people, accepting that you cannot control other people's emotions. This is an area that often gets lost when we talk about boundaries, is emotional boundaries. Like their emotions are on their property, not on yours. So people pleasing often is this mentality of I can control. Now we can influence, but we cannot control others' emotions. And this is a endless, helpless cycle. The more and more that I try to do to please, and the more and more that I try to do to control their emotions, the more that I'm exhausted and the more suffering that I'm causing versus causing myself, which can be alleviated if I just radically accept that's not on my property, that's not my responsibility.
Sure.
And then, other things like perfectionism, there are certain truths that you need to accept, like I cannot do everything perfectly. That is something that, seems when I don't know if you're ever having conversations with perfectionists, but when they start talking about these things, I'm like, there's an element of delusion, and there's no judgment in that of saying like, wow, how terrible. We all have elements of delusion, but we forget the reality of like, wow, I cannot do everything perfectly all the time. Or when I hear patients who make one mistake and they're like, I'm a failure. Like, I don't know if you've seen that reel that basically there's these two people talking and one says, what would you tell a person if, they made a mistake? You're like, oh no, don't worry about it. What would you tell them? And it goes through this, and they're all this very compassionate. And then the person says, well, what if you make a mistake? And they're like, oh no, like I could never make a mistake. And it's just this lack of acceptance of reality that it's not possible to do everything perfectly all the time. And so Notice, hopefully I've given enough examples and very broad examples, whether it's like life events or whether it's, illnesses or just kind of patterns that we have, that so much of this is taking up our energy, causing us so much more suffering than what's needed if I just start to approach life as this is what it is and I accept it, and then maybe I can change it, or I need to accept that I can't change it.
Yeah, the only thing I would add or maybe elaborate on, or the things that sort of come to my mind on this list that you've given us, is acceptance of your own thoughts and acceptance of your own emotions. And you did mention the emotions of others and accepting their emotions, but I think it's also incredibly important that we do that. And I don't necessarily mean, and I know you've said this before, previously in this particular discussion. You're not saying like I'm not going to just accept it fully with no regard for a desire to change in the future, but I'm accepting these emotions or these thoughts in this present moment, right, and dealing with it. And this has become a common conversation that I might have with somebody that has experienced a lot of trauma in their past. There are certain emotions that come from there's obviously certain emotions that come from the experience of trauma, and so there's a certain acceptance of the reality that the trauma happened, and then acceptance of the reaction that your own physiology has continued to have as a result of said trauma. The other thing I'll just add is, and the reason I suggest this is because it's come up with a number of my patients, is accepting of the way that your brain functions. I've had many patients that are sitting here, in front of me, sort of crying, maybe talk like with self-loathing because they're just like, I hate the way my brain works, right? And we're obviously talking in sort of the context of mental health, and so typically after a statement like that is made, we end up talking sort of about this particular concept, if you will. And so those would just be a couple other things that come to my mind in the list that you've already given us.
Yeah, and I want to comment on those. Those are great. I'm really glad that you brought it up and kind of talked and touched on them a little bit. With the thoughts and emotions, this is a little bit a part of acceptance and commitment therapy. It's not just accepting what my thoughts are, which are not saying that they're okay. It's saying it's just a thought. And that's really powerful because it's like, hey, I can own if I think, oh, I'm so stupid. You put space between you and your thought and you say, I am having the thought that, because that's the reality. The reality is thoughts are just thoughts. And not too long ago, I don't know when it'll be released, but I did a episode with someone who suffered from postpartum depression, anxiety, and the fearfulness of having the thought of harming her baby. And so her having this radical acceptance, a thought is just a thought, and not attributing more to that of like, that's who I am, this is what I'm really believing, and even alongside that, the emotions that went along with it. So I'm glad that you brought that up. And then I love too that accepting the way that the brain works, that also applies to the body. And I think the most common times that comes up is with ADHD. Instead of causing more suffering by not accepting the way that your brain works and trying to fit the molds of other people's brains, when they learn to accept, this is my brain, this is how it works, and then, then they can change and adjust accordingly, they find a lot of freedom and liberty. So glad that you mentioned those situations and examples.
Well, thank you. So moving to a practical aspect of this, what are some of the takeaways that we can start with in terms of applying and overcoming, in terms of applying radical acceptance into our everyday lives?
So there's no direct steps in the sense of like, not everyone, this is not a universal thing, but through my experience, I've kind of brought together several steps from different protocols, and much of it is from the DBT manual. But the first one is just observing the resistance. That's kind of the flag that tells you, hello, you need to engage in radical acceptance. And you can take the three-pronged approach of emotions, thoughts, and behaviors. So emotions, for example, a key emotion that often suggests that you're resisting reality is anger and all the different kind of forms of it. So anger, bitterness, annoyance, irritation. Those are the most common emotions. The thoughts, you'll often hear, why me? Why is this happening? For some Christians, it'll be why God. Another one that I often hear is that I can't stand this. It's a resistance of like, I can't stand this. I can't handle this. It shouldn't be this way, right? These different complaints of pushing back on reality. This isn't fair. So those are common thoughts. And now, again, not exhaustive, but some to give people ideas of what it might look like for them. And then behaviors I alluded to earlier of avoidance, or the opposite of avoidance, which is over control. And so when we start noticing these behaviors and thoughts and emotions, we can start saying, okay, now that I know that I'm resisting reality, then the second step would be reminding yourself that the unpleasant reality, whatever you're trying to fight, is the reality. That I cannot, just by resisting reality, it doesn't change the reality. So sometimes people notice the anger, then they just quickly say, it is what it is. Now, I also practice this. There are some things that I get annoyed about, and I'm like, Katie, it is what it is. Or oftentimes it's like, Katie with a client or something, I'm like, oh, why aren't they doing this? And I'm like, Katie, and I remind myself of the reality of they're struggling with X thing. Or Katie, that's all that they know right now. You cannot expect more. And so I do this as well. Now, what I like to do, this isn't like an official step, but just kind of a bonus step, is imagine what things would look like if you did accept the situation. So going back to the chronic pain example, what would life look like if I fully accepted that I have chronic pain? Maybe I'll pace myself and I won't be exhausted all the time. Maybe, like as you mentioned, Jonathan, I'll be more present with my family. Maybe I'm not going to be endlessly chasing all these other things. Now, there's obviously a balance with that where maybe there are things that you do need to chase. But what would life look like if I fully accepted this reality? The next step is once you recognize it, once you remind yourself, then you want to make an inner commitment to accept reality. And notice it starts with a commitment, like I want to, hopefully by this episode, people are like, oh, I see the value of that. I want to, but it doesn't mean that you automatically accept. And I like that there's a sub kind of skill to radical acceptance called turning the mind, which presents a fork. Those who are watching will see the sort of fork that I'm trying to present here. There's a fork in the road. On one side is rejection, resistance, which includes more suffering, or acceptance. And so when we make this inner commitment, we are putting ourselves on the path of acceptance. And I really appreciate this because kind of going back to our conversation, Jonathan, about trauma, it's really hard to accept something that big. It's even hard for people with road rage or other smaller things, but acceptance is hard. So this step is saying, I don't have to fully accept it quite yet, but I want to put myself on the path of acceptance. And as I'm walking on the path, then the next step is do it over and over and over and over again. I like to use this example because I think it illustrates this point, the difference between emotional forgiveness and decisional forgiveness. So I often will educate my clients, there's the decisional forgiveness that comes first. Your emotions may not be there yet. Or it's kind of like with empathy, there's the cognitive element of empathy where you're trying to understand, but then there's the actual, demonstration or manifestation of empathy. But decisional forgiveness is saying, I'm putting myself on the path, even though my emotions haven't caught up. And then as you do it over and over and over again, obviously you're creating, new pathways in your brain, but then it becomes easier and easier to accept. Now, sometimes something comes out of, the blue where you're like, I thought I accepted that. It's okay. Just put yourself back on that path and do it over and over and over again. And sometimes you can come up with phrases that are helpful to remind you, like if talking about accepting emotions, you might say, emotions don't last forever. You need to accept that reality. Like they're not here because our brain starts going like, oh, you're going to stay here forever. It's terrible. Avoid. It's like, no. Sometimes there's phrases that you can repeat to yourself that can be helpful to remind yourself to stay on that path. But also one thing that's really fascinating, and I won't get into this too much, but another way to make a commitment to accept is also with your body. So DBT talks about the 2 sub-skills, which are half smiling and what's the other one? There's half smiling and there's willing hands. And what that's saying is you can start accepting reality better if your body then communicates to your brain. So if I go around with my arms crossed and say, I need to accept reality, which DBT, I love that it says this. It talks about like, these are kind of adult tantrums. Let's be real. Let's call it as it is. Fighting reality is an adult tantrum. We don't like it. I don't like it. But if I go around crossed arms and saying, I need to accept reality with a frown on my face, I may be telling my brain to accept it, but my body is telling me, don't, you're not going to. So we can even practically make that choice of acceptance by opening up my posture. That's the willing hand, is opening up my posture to, instead of frowning, smiling. And I like that it emphasizes half smiling, because you may not be fully there yet, but you can just do a half smile. And there's even research that shows, well, one research study has people put a pencil in their mouth and forced a smile, and it actually improved their mood, right? So there's this element where the body does communicate with the brain as well. And so part of radical acceptance is you put yourself on the path, you then make that commitment over and over and over again, creating those new pathways. And then the last step is, as I mentioned, you may fall off the wagon, you may, need to accept again, is develop a plan for catching yourself in the future when you drift out of acceptance. And I like that language, because it might be a slow, gradual drift. Maybe you're like, okay, I've overcome road rage, but then something happens and you're like, it's back. It's not back. Just recommit and continue to put yourself on that path of acceptance.
Excellent. Yeah, there's a lot of, I think I would need to go back and listen to that whole section again as well. Because as you said, there's no real defined structure with radical acceptance, and the journey of getting to that point is going to be ongoing and might look a little bit different for every person. I should say will look a little bit different for every person. So just as a quick reminder, the main steps were: observe your emotion, thoughts, and behaviors. Remind yourself of the unpleasant reality and that it cannot be changed. Imagine what things would be like if you accepted the situation. Make an inner commitment to accept reality as it is and put yourself on the path of acceptance, and then repeat it over and over again. And then develop a plan for if in the future you do drift out of that acceptance state. And so one thing I did want to emphasize of what we just said is, the term radical sort of gives the idea of this kind of black and white, all or nothing thinking, in a sense, and that is ultimately the goal, right?
Yeah.
But we don't want to be caught up in the perfectionistic attitude that we're only going to accept something that is completely radical. And so this gradation approach that you sort of mentioned in terms of making that commitment and getting one step closer, if you will, or 1% better towards that state of acceptance of whatever it is that maybe you might be dealing with is definitely progress and should be cheered when it is achieved. So I'm definitely excited about this particular episode and the future DBT episodes that are going to be a part of this series. I know you have definitely a unique and powerful way of looking at these particular concepts, and I know they're changing a lot of people's lives. So thank you for your insight, Katie, and I really, really, really hope that our patients will. I should say our listeners caught in that mindset, but our listeners of this particular episode and the other DBT episodes will take the information to heart. Will share these episodes with those that they feel are going to benefit from them, and start practicing. Maybe if you're driving and you are prone to road rage, and somebody cut you off during this particular episode, now's a perfect time to start thinking about radical acceptance and working on that particular emotional issue. So, thanks again. We look forward to you listening to our next episode. So, thank you for being with us today. Thanks for listening. If you enjoyed today's episode, please like and subscribe. Your engagement will help us reach more people who need encouragement. To hear more episodes, learn about our other mental health resources, or support us financially, visit thebrainpeoplepodcast.com.